The Colston Four, so called, to cheers and chants from their supporters, left court today acquitted of criminal damage. And by a jury which one defence lawyer had urged to be on the right side of history.
We just want to say thank you to so many people, because we have never been alone in this journey. We've been so supported, and we are, we're such a small part of this, really. There were so many people that day, so many people reverberating across the world in response to it.
We didn't change history, we rectified history.
Stay alive, we illuminated history.
And this is a victory for Bristol, this is a victory for racial equality, and this is a victory for anyone who wants to be on the right side of history.
The toppling of the Colston statue. It became one of the defining images of the Black Lives Matter movement, whose consequences still ripple through the city of Bristol more than 18 months on. Jurors had seen footage of Sage Willoughby, who's 22, placing a rope around the head of the statue memorialising the slave trader Edward Colston. It was an act of love for others, he told the court. Milo Ponsford, also in his 20s, supplied one of the ropes. He said he considered the statue a disgrace in such a multicultural city. Bringing it down was an idea mentioned the night before and overheard by Rhian Graham, who's 30. She also brought a rope, describing Bristol as a liberal city with a mass murderer venerated at its heart. And then there was Jake Skews, involved in rolling the statue 500 metres or so towards the harbour. All I cared about, he said, was how to get it in the river to stop the council putting it back up again. The prosecution had told the court that they weren't apologists for Edward Colston and his ilk, but this trial wasn't about him, it was about the actions of the defendants. Yet it was precisely the story of Edward Colston which the defence said was entirely relevant to this case. So jurors heard from the historian David Olusoga, who said that Colston had in effect been the CEO of a company responsible for enslaving more Africans than any other in British history. Another witness spoke of her enslaved ancestors and said that the statue had been profoundly shameful. A clear case of criminal damage, claimed the prosecution. The defence summed up perhaps by the remark of one lawyer: if you have a cancer like Colston festering in your city, you cut it out. In a city criticised for years of indecision over the future of this statue, it took a jury less than 3 hours deliberating to find all four not guilty.
We all have ability to say how our space is decorated and who we venerate and who we celebrate, and one thing that we know now is that Colston does not represent Bristol.
Bristol marks another landmark moment in its troubled relationship with the statue of Edward Colston. Its felling now replicated on T-shirts designed by Banksy and proudly worn by those acquitted today. A moment which would be referenced at the funeral of George Floyd, the man whose murder sparked that Bristol protest. Bit by bit, the name Colston disappears from the buildings of this city. But the toxic debate it helped fuel over how we memorialise the past continues. And so too the questions about what happens next to that disfigured, graffiti-daubed statue itself, salvaged, exhibited, and now back in storage.
Andy Davis with that report. Well, I'm joined now by the lawyer who successfully represented 2 of the 4 defendants in court, Raj Chadha. Thanks very much for coming on the programme. So there was wanton damage, but it wasn't criminal. What was the argument, you think, that swayed the jury to acquit the 4?
There were a number of arguments, but the main one is the offensive nature of the statue. That here in the middle of Bristol, this person who had enslaved hundreds of thousands of people was venerated, and there was no context. There was a plaque that said that he was one of the noblest and wisest sons of Bristol. And really, I think it was about the offensive nature, and hence the statue itself, its presence was a criminal offence, and the council, by failing to take action, it was the one that was committing the criminal offence.
There are some that would argue that this now creates a legal precedent and indeed gives a green light to those who don't like other statues, like, for instance, the statue of Winston Churchill. What do you say to that?
There's no legal precedent created by this case. It very much turns on its own facts, and it turns on what the jury heard. And what the jury heard, as your piece said, was the evidence from Professor Olusogo about the slave trade, but also the inaction of Bristol City Council over many, many years. And clearly the jury agreed that that was offensive in of itself.
But if people out there, and there are many who want to topple the statue of Winston Churchill in Parliament Square, if that were to happen, and let's say there were 6 of them, would you personally want to defend the Churchill 6?
Well, as a defence lawyer, I will defend those that seek to instruct me and those that are entitled to a proper defence. But each case will turn on its own facts. And as I repeat, it's not a precedent for anything, but it's shameful that this prosecution was ever brought in the first place. It's shameful that, bearing in mind the history of this particular statue, why the CPS thought it was in the public interest to proceed.
It's interesting. I read this afternoon that the defendants were offered a magistrate's court but chose a Crown Court because of the jury. Is that true, and why do they want to do that?
They did choose a jury trial, as is their right. The criminal damage was assessed at above £5,000, and so they had a right to a jury trial. And this shows the value of jury trials. It shows the idea that local people, representatives of local people, come together and apply their common sense to legal problems. And it's absolutely a vindication of the jury system.
And why is that?
Because it wasn't for a judge or a professional lawyer to assess what is reasonable, what is proportionate. It is for the ordinary person in the street and people who live in Bristol and know what the context of this statute might be. And they're the ones that have decided that these 4 individuals shouldn't be convicted. And that is as it should be.